We call this using the Pali words, Lokiya and Lokuttara Dhamma. That is the mundane or world application teaching, and the Lokuttara is the supramundane or world transcendent teaching. And then if we want to use a more elaborate scheme, there's a scheme that, I've encountered this in Master Yinshun's The Way to Buddhahood, but I think he derives this from earlier classifications in Chinese Buddhism. So the mundane teaching will be divided into the human vehicle, and the celestial or heavenly vehicle. These would be the teachings that are applicable to the human realm and that lead to a favorable rebirth within the human realm. And then we have the celestial vehicle, the teachings that are conducive to a rebirth into the heavenly or celestial realms. Then we have the world transcendent teachings. According to the Chinese way of classification, we have the three vehicles of the disciples or Shravakas, the vehicle of the Pratyeka Buddhas, sometimes called the solitary or non-teaching Buddhas. And then we have the Bodhisattva vehicle. So the teachings that come under the heading of being world transcendent, those are the teachings that are sort of unique and special to the Buddha Dharma, including the teachings on three characteristics, dependent origination, Four Noble Truths, and the practices that bring this world transcendent realization. The four foundations of mindfulness, the development of the five spiritual faculties, the 7 factors of enlightenment, the Noble Eightfold Path. But what's important to realize is that to develop successfully the world transcendent teachings, one has to base them upon a secure foundation of the mundane teachings, which are the basic teachings in generosity, ethics, right attitudes, and even what's called the mundane right view. So, many people, especially in the West, when they come across Buddhism, they get all excited about very deep philosophical issues, like the meaning of emptiness, mind only, non-self, dependent origination. They want to practice intensive insight meditation, quickly get enlightenment. But when you come to the very basic, mundane teachings, they think boring, uninteresting, not essential. But the Buddha's teaching, we have to see, is something like constructing a building. If you don't have a secure foundation, you want to have some beautiful rooms on the second floor, maybe with a ornamental roof, with these sloping, maybe you design the roof in Tang Dynasty style, with curves and very beautifully designed. Then you have a pinnacle on the top, but you don't have a solid foundation, what's going to happen to the house? What will happen? The house will start after 6 months, a year. The house is going to start to collapse, right? Or it's starting to decay and break down, and then it collapses. So if we want to build a solid, secure house, have to start with very basic practices and really make a strong commitment and dedication to these practices. And then one could build up the house story by story. And when you have a solid foundation, when the ground floor is solid with strong timber, steady, solid walls, well-designed scaffolding of the house, then you can build the second floor and put in your fancy rooms and build a very decorative roof and put a nice pinnacle on top of the roof. And so for this reason, when the Buddha teaches, when we come across the Buddha, sort of the outline of the Buddha's teaching that we encounter often in the suttas, we see that the Buddha teaches what's called anupubhika kata. Anupubhika. That is a graduated teaching, a step-by-step teaching. So the Buddha, when he's speaking to a new audience, he'll begin with the practices of dana, generosity, the practice of sila, of virtue, covering these quite extensively. Then he'll bring in the teachings on the heavenly realms, explaining how the practices of generosity and virtuous conduct can lead to rebirth in the heavenly realms. Then gradually he'll introduce the teaching on what's the text called the danger, the unsatisfactoriness in sensual pleasures, the benefits of renunciation. And then when the Buddha sees that the minds of the people who he's speaking to have become settled, calm, confident, trusting, clear of obstructions, clear of hindrances, then he introduces the teaching that's special to the Buddha. That is the teaching on the Four Noble Truths. Okay, and so in the sutta that is given, that we'll be looking at today, these are the teachings which you might say constitute the timber, the 2x4s, the planks that are going to form the foundation of the house of Dharma practice. These are very basic teachings. And it seems it's even a bit intriguing that the Buddha gives this discourse not to householders, but he's giving it to the community of monks on a full moon night. Usually on the full moon night, the Buddha speaks on profound subjects. But here he's speaking on these very basic practices. Okay, so let us take a look at the sutta. Okay, so here the sutta unfolds when the Buddha is living at Savatthi in the eastern park, in the palace of Megara's mother. And so this is the Uposatha day, that's the day of the special observance, the 15th day of the fortnight, and it's the full moon night. And so the Buddha is sitting out in the open, surrounded by the community of monks. And then after all of the monks are sitting there silently in meditation, then they're expecting the Buddha at a certain point to begin to speak to them. So when the Buddha feels that the time is ready, then he begins to speak. And he begins with introducing the topic of this discourse, which will be the contrast between what is here called And I don't like this terminology, but I think it was what Venerable Nyanamoli used in the original draft of this translation. It's the contrast between what is here called an untrue man and a true man. We have to remember that Venerable Nyanamoli was translating back in the early 1950s when the word man still stood for any human being. So now if I were to revise this, I would use, instead of man, I would use person. And I don't even like untrue and true. I think that's a little bit misleading or inaccurate or even unclear. Let's take the Pali words that are used here. At first, the word that is rendered man is purisa, which sometimes the word purisa is used in contrast to iti. In that case, it means a man in contrast to a woman. But purisa can also function as a general word for just for any human being. So it can be a man or a woman. So we would say the purisa is person. And then it's prefixed. Well, the primary prefix here would be the word sat, which can mean both true and also good. So for example, in the word satya, we have the Four Noble Truths. These are the four Chattari Arya Satchani, Satchang. There we have truth. And so on that basis, we can say that sat has the implication of what is true. But the word sat also has the meaning of good. And in some contexts, good is preferable to true. So I think here we could say that the contrast, the asapurisa, is the person who is not good, or we could say the bad person, and sappurisa is the person who is good, the good person. Yeah, that is maybe a little more elaborate than is necessary. But I mean, it's on the mark, we could say. But to keep it very simple, we could just say a good person and a bad person. And what is significant in the use of this term, especially the term sappurisa, is that this seems to be a kind of ideal that the Buddha was setting up for people in the society of the period in which he lived. In the period in which the Buddha was living, in the mainstream society, because it was divided into the four social classes, which came to be later called the castes and formed the basis for the caste system. So we have the distinction here between the Brahmin, who is the priest, the specialist in the religious lore of the Vedas, the one who's entitled to perform the religious ceremonies, especially for the royalty, but even for everybody in their day-to-day life. Then we have the Kshatriyas or Khatiyas. the administrative class, the rulers, the administrators, the warriors. Then we have the Vaishyas, who would be the mercantile caste, the class of people involved in business, trade, also the people who owned large plots of land for cultivation of crops and cattle. And then we have the Sudras, the menial class, the working class, the lower class. And then beyond them, outside of them, we have those who are outside the class system. And so within the framework of the class system, it was believed, or at least the Brahmins propagated the idea that in order to be a useful member of society, a person has to fulfill the duties that are incumbent upon them by reason of their position within the class system. So the Brahmin should fulfill his functions, the Kshatriyas should rule and administer the land, the Vaishyas should fulfill their responsibilities of trade, business, finance, cultivation, and the Shudras should just work for the others and serve the others. But the Buddha replaced, or at least he was attempting to replace, this rigid class system with a different social system in which what was of primary significance was not a person's birth, not their social class status, but their inner qualities. And to promote this vision or this social ideal, the Buddha developed this concept of the sappurisa, the good person, who is not restricted to any particular social class, but serves as an ideal which members of any social class should strive to fulfill. And so even though the Buddha didn't explicitly reject the class system, but in his own teaching it seems that he would still speak about the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, but he would collapse the members of all the other social classes into the broad category of householders, Gahapati. And then even putting the social class distinction sort of on the margins, the Buddha held up for all of his followers the ideal of the sappurisa. And so for whatever one's class position within the mainstream society, one's worth as a person, one's worth as an individual is determined by the degree to which one measures up to the standard of the sappurisa. And so the sappurisa is not necessarily a noble one, not necessarily one who has reached the stages of noble realization, transcendent realization, because that probably would have been confined to a relatively small number of people in the Buddhist community. Of course, the Buddha set up the ideal standard as being the attainment of the 4 stages of realization. But for the great majority of disciples, the Buddha laid down guidelines which would direct them towards the ideal of the sappurisa, the good person, the person who is able to live effectively for his own benefit, the benefit of others, the benefit of society as a whole. And so in this sutta, we could say that, or see that the Buddha is positing this contrast between people distinguished as either good or bad, not on the basis of their class position, not on the basis of whether they're fulfilling their social class obligations according to the rigid class system, but on the basis of certain other criteria that the Buddha is laying out, criteria which distinguishes one as either asappurisa, a non-good or a bad person, or sappurisa, a good person. And so let's see now how this theme is developed in this sutta. And it begins with a statement I find a little bit curious. I'll use my revised translation rather than the original translation here. So the Buddha is saying, monks, would a bad person know of a bad person? This person is a bad person. And then the monks say, no, Venerable Sir. And then the Buddha says, good. It's impossible, it cannot be, that a bad person would know of a bad person. This one is a bad person. Then he says, would a bad person know of a good person? This one is a good person. And the monks say no, and then the Buddha says, good, it's impossible, it cannot be, that a bad person would know of a good person. This person is a good person. I have to say, I find this puzzling, because there's a statement I think I've heard, circulating in America, that when a thief meets another thief, he knows right away that that one is a thief. And I know, back in the days when I was a bad, mischievous student in class, when we would start a new class, come into the classroom and you look around, and being a mischievous little student, I could look around and I could see which ones are going to be my companions amongst the troublemakers, and which ones are going to be the ones we would call the brown noses. Do they still use that expression? Or maybe the Chinese students don't, or Chinese ones here don't know that expression. This is the one who tries to ingratiate himself to the teacher, or does the, brushes off the teacher's seat at the beginning of the class, gives the teacher the apple, brings an apple for the teacher in the class. So I come into the class and I could look at my pals, the guys who are going to be my pals, and the students that we're going to beat up after class. You're a psychologist, so you should be able to. Okay, say that again into the microphone.
Is this working? Yeah. I was wondering if what he was saying was that a bad person is a person who does not know the difference between right and wrong.
It doesn't seem that he's saying that here, because if that was the intention, he would have he would express that in a different way. He would say, does a bad person know what is unwholesome and what is wholesome, or what is bad or what is good? So it's puzzling to me, this statement. Does anybody have any ideas about this? Is it Katie in the back? Please take the microphone.
Maybe it's similar to what both are saying. One is enjoying one's fellow company and not really saying, I'm bad, he's bad. One's just saying, there's my kind. And
yeah, or maybe actually what you said just gave an idea, planted an idea in my mind. Maybe the sense is that maybe also this will tie in what David suggested, that the bad person, he'll know who the bad person is. He'll know that this is the one that either he's going to team up with, or the one that he's going to treat as a rival if they're both in a competition for some position. But he won't recognize the fact that what they're doing is bad. And he won't feel some kind of repulsion, repugnance towards the bad qualities of the other bad person. And also he won't recognize that the good person is a person that he should be emulating. And he won't appreciate the good qualities of the good person. So maybe that's a solution to the problem here. Okay, so now the Buddha is going to now enumerate a number of features that distinguish the bad person as being bad. It actually turns out that there are 8 criteria here for distinguishing the bad person. So he's possessed of bad qualities. Then the second is that he associates with other bad persons. The third is that here is translated, he wills, or we could even say he thinks as a bad person. Then he gives counsel or advice in the way that a bad person does. Then he speaks as a bad person. He acts as a bad person. He holds the views of a bad person. And when he gives gifts, he gives them in the manner of a bad person. Okay, so now the Buddha first, he sets up this kind of summary or outline of the teaching. And now he's going to elaborate on each of these criteria of the bad person. So first he raises the question, how is the bad person possessed of bad qualities? And then he mentions here 7 qualities, which I prefer to take them actually as the qualities, the opposites, the qualities of the good person. So we could jump over to the next page, page 894, and page 16. Because here we have a list of 7 qualities that we meet not often, but we meet occasionally throughout the texts. I think we meet them especially several times in the Anguttara Nikaya, in the Book of the Sevens, but elsewhere in the Majjhima Nikaya. So these 7 qualities that are mentioned form a set, which are called the good, simply the good qualities, or the qualities of the good person. And so here it said that the good person has faith, shame, fear of wrongdoing. He's learned, energetic, mindful, and wise. So these qualities are laid out in a way which forms a kind of sequence. And so at the foundation of the 7 good qualities, we have faith. And here, I don't think that faith is intended necessarily in the sense of faith as necessarily in the sense of accepting all of the Buddha's teachings. But what I understand by this term is a basic faith in, I would say, in the fact that there is a law of goodness, a universal law sort of operating behind the scenes, which will support a good person in their endeavors to fulfill goodness, a law which will bring happiness, fulfillment, spiritual development to a person who devotes himself or herself to the good. And so having faith in this sense is not restricted, I would say it's not restricted or confined to specific Buddhist faith, but I would say like a person of any religious conviction or even of no religious conviction at all who still believes that there is value, benefit in doing what is virtuous and wholesome will have this kind of faith. And this would be contrasted to the attitude of the bad person who would take the position that there's no point in doing good, no point in avoiding evil, that there are no consequences of one's actions, that one could behave in any way oneself, one could behave in any way one wishes, and especially who thinks that they can behave in bad, evil ways and get away with it when nobody knows what they're doing. Okay, on the basis of faith, a kind of trust in the power of goodness, then one has, or there emerges two other qualities which are always paired in the suttas, which work together as a team. These are the qualities which are called in Pali hiri and ottappa. And so faith is saddha, faith or trust. Then based on this faith and trust, there arise these two qualities, hiri and ottappa, which the Buddha calls these two qualities the guardians of the world, the lokapala, the two qualities that protect the world. And these are the two qualities which are the basis, well, you could say even the roots of ethical behavior, the roots of moral behavior. What is called hiri, when we translate it as shame, it's a little, the sense of shame, it's a little misleading, because the sense of shame is something that usually arises when we've committed something bad or unwholesome. Then afterwards we feel some embarrassment about it. And that's the ordinary significance of the English word shame. But hiri is a quality that operates, it has a kind of anticipating role. It's the quality that prevents one from doing something unwholesome, something unethical, from the realization that by behaving in this way, one will be losing one's self-respect. One will be detracting from one's own inner dignity, that one will be creating a blemish on one's own character, or that one will be blocking the full flowering of one's potential nobility of character. And so hiri is an inward voice that tells one, if one behaves in such a way, if one engages in such behavior, one will not be able to live comfortably with oneself. One will be soiling the potential purity of one's mind. One will be creating inner obstacles to one's spiritual development. Now, this quality of hiri is paired with this other quality called ottappa, which comes from a root. The root of the word ottappa is the middle three letters tup, which means to burn. And so ottappa means, here it's translated fear of wrongdoing. We might also translate it as moral dread. And this is the quality, the inner voice that prevents one from doing wrong, what's unwholesome, what's ethically bad, from fear of the consequences. from a fear that, for example, if other people find out what one has done, then one is going to be blamed and criticized by others, rejected by others. One becomes a social pariah, a social outcast. Or it can take the form of fear of the consequences, fear that if it's something that's really bad or unwholesome, illegal, that one will be caught by the law and be arrested and have to serve time in prison. And then also, this fear of consequences is coupled with an understanding of the law of karma. So one realizes that if one does something unwholesome, even if one cannot get away with it in the face of society, if one thinks one is clever enough that one could conceal one's wrongdoing so nobody will discover and punish one in this world, one still has to face the consequences of the maturation of one's karma. That the karma, the unwholesome karma created by that immoral, unethical action is going to catch up with one and bring an unhappy rebirth, bring misery and suffering in the future. And so in some of the commentaries, the distinction between hiri and ottappa, the sense of shame and moral dread, is illustrated with the simile of a piece of timber or a log, which, let's see, at both ends it's burning, it's blazing with flame, and in the middle it's soiled with feces. And so a person doesn't want to touch the log in the middle, because if he picks it up in the middle, he'll get soiled by the feces. And he doesn't want to pick it up on either end, because if he tries to do that, his hand will get burnt. And so getting soiled with the feces, that is illustrated by which of these two qualities? Right, hiri, the sense of shame, and then not wanting to pick up the log because from fear that one will be burnt by touching the flame. That is like ottappa, fear of the consequences, or moral dread. Okay, David?
This is like you're talking about developing a sense of morality. Right?
Exactly.
That's what this is.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. That's why I say that these are the two sort of underlying roots of sila, of moral behavior.
It's like a superego.
Oh, yeah, exactly, yeah. Very close. Katie. I said fear of wrongdoing, moral dread, and you said conscientiousness?
At the Abhidhamma retreat, I think you had also offered for ottappa conscientiousness with and/or moral dread. Is that still something you think is like conscientiousness, or is that the fruit of these two things?
I'd say conscientiousness. Yeah, it could be taken as close to hiri.
Okay.
You were saying that I explained it as moral dread?
I think during the Abhidhamma, you had proposed, and someone can definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but that hiri would be shame, but that was, you had cautioned us about the strength of that word, or the emotion that can come up with that word. But I thought ottappa, moral dread, was also translated as conscientiousness, but you had preferred moral dread.
Yeah, I think conscientious, if somebody's being conscientious, it seems to me that they're heeding the inner voice of conscience rather than fear of the consequences.
So more hiri.
Yeah, I would say conscientiousness is closer to hiri.
Okay.
So maybe it embraces both of them.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so let's continue now. Okay, so we have faith, shame, fear of wrongdoing. The next one is learning, which here, of course, would refer to the learning of religious texts, this, what we call the sacred scriptures. It's not like learning, being very learned in French literature of the 17th century, or French literature of the 19th century, which might have a corrupting influence on somebody's morals. Or learning in the physical sciences, but this is, in the Buddha's time, the word here is actually sutta, which means hearing, having heard a lot, because when one attends religious expositions of religious teachings, the way one acquires learning is to attend expositions or discourses on religious teachings. Rather than, in the Buddha's time, there were not printed books. Okay, and so learning is considered an important good quality. And then that comes, now we have the three qualities which are actually moving towards transcendent realization. This is energy, which is always explained as the effort to remove what is unwholesome and cultivate the wholesome. Then being mindful, in the sense of having a basic awareness. Probably here, maybe we could say mindfulness is intended more in a moral sense than in the meditative sense. So being mindful, say, of one's states of mind, one's motivations, being mindful of what one is doing so that one can restrain oneself from doing